Imagine standing before a city unlike anything you've ever seen. Towering walls of earth stretch further than the eye can see, so long in fact that when measured they would prove to be 4 times greater than the Great Wall of China. Inside these walls are broad streets, perfectly aligned, stretching across a metropolis that rivals the great cities of Europe. At its heart, a palace so vast and decorated with ivory, bronze, and coral that it humbles even seasoned travelers. This is not Rome. This is not Paris. This is not a forgotten myth like Atlantis. This is Benin. The Kingdom of Benin, located in what is today southern Nigeria, was one of the most extraordinary civilizations Africa, and indeed the world, has ever produced. For centuries, it thrived as a hub of culture, trade, art, and political innovation. Yet, despite its scale and brilliance, its story remains hidden from most of the world. Why? Because history is written not just by victors, but also by those who seek to erase. Western textbooks have long painted a narrow, distorted picture of Africa. They often start with Egypt, leap centuries ahead to European colonization, and leave vast swathes of African brilliance in the shadows. But between those pages lies Benin, a kingdom that forces us to rethink what we thought we knew about civilization itself. To early European explorers, Benin City was a revelation. The Dutchman Alfred Dapper, writing in the 17th century, marveled at its orderly layout, its clean and wide streets, its grand houses and decorated courtyards. Others described a capital so well planned that it stood in stark contrast to the crowded, chaotic towns of Europe at the time. Imagine their shock, traveling thousands of miles, only to find an African city far more advanced in urban planning than many capitals back home. But Benin was more than just infrastructure. It was a kingdom alive with artistry. Its bronzes, crafted with techniques so advanced they still baffle metallurgists today, told the story of kings, warriors, priests, and everyday life in stunning detail. These weren't just decorations, they were history books cast in metal, archives preserved in art. Each plaque and sculpture was a reminder that this was not a land of darkness, as colonial propaganda would later suggest, but a beacon of creativity and intellectual achievement. At the center of it all stood the Oba, the divine king, believed to be the spiritual and political heart of the nation. His rule was not arbitrary but supported by a complex system of chiefs, councils, and guilds, organizations so well structured that they managed everything from military campaigns to trade networks to the regulation of craftsmanship. Benin's society was orderly, balanced, and intentional. It was not chaos. It was civilization, sophisticated, disciplined, and thriving. And yet, for most of us, the story of Benin only appears at its tragic end. The British Punitive Expedition of 1897, when soldiers burned the city to the ground and looted its treasures. For many, that is the first time Benin enters history books. But the truth is, Benin's story spans centuries of glory long before that tragedy. To reduce it only to its fall is to repeat the erasure that colonizers intended. That is why this story matters. Because to tell the story of Benin is to challenge centuries of Eurocentric lies. It is to recognize that Africa was never a passive continent waiting for civilization to arrive. It had its own empires, its own golden ages, its own Atlantean marvels hidden in plain sight. So as we begin this journey, we will peel back the layers of silence. We will walk the streets of Benin City. We will enter its palace, its marketplaces, its temples. We will witness the genius of its bronze casters and the wisdom of its rulers. And we will confront the tragedy of its destruction, and the ongoing battle to reclaim what was stolen. This is not just African history, it is world history. Because the story of Benin is a reminder that human brilliance knows no boundaries. That greatness is not confined to one continent or one race or one narrative. This is the true story of the Benin Kingdom, Africa's Real Atlantis, hidden not by the sea but by silence. When we think of ancient civilizations, the same names always rise to the surface: Rome, Greece, Egypt, Mesopotamia. These are the cultures celebrated in classrooms, carved into Hollywood films, and etched into the global imagination. But here lies the problem. By focusing on these familiar centers, we are taught, sometimes intentionally, sometimes through silence, that Africa south of the Sahara was somehow outside of world history. And yet, standing in the heart of southern Nigeria, the Kingdom of Benin was proving that narrative false for centuries. Benin City was not just another settlement, it was a wonder of the world. Stretching across miles, its urban planning rivaled that of Europe's greatest capitals. Archaeologists have measured the city's massive earthworks, an interconnected system of walls and moats running for an astonishing 16,000 kilometers. To put that in perspective, that's 4 times longer than the Great Wall of China. These weren't crude barriers of mud and sticks, but carefully engineered structures, fortifications that spoke of a people who understood defense, order, and monumental design. European visitors who stumbled upon Benin in the 15th and 16th centuries could hardly believe their eyes. They described wide, straight streets, clean and organized markets, and houses built with a precision that contrasted sharply with the congested, chaotic towns of Europe at the time. Imagine being a Portuguese trader who had just left Lisbon, a city reeking of uncollected waste and narrow, crooked alleys, only to find yourself walking through a city in Africa that looked not like a village, but like the beating heart of a great empire. But Benin was more than stone and soil. It was a living organism. At its center was the Oba, the king, revered not just as a political ruler but as a divine figure. To the people of Benin, the Oba was the bridge between the earthly world and the spiritual realm. His palace, sprawling across acres, was the symbol of this sacred authority, an architectural statement of power, adorned with intricate carvings and decorated with ivory, coral, and bronze. Supporting the Oba was a complex web of chiefs, councils, and guilds. The guild system of Benin was particularly extraordinary. Imagine a society where every craft, every trade, every skill was organized into professional associations with strict codes of practice. There were guilds for bronze casters, for ivory carvers, for soldiers, for traders, even for ritual specialists. These guilds weren't just economic, they were political and spiritual, woven into the very structure of the kingdom. This ensured that Benin was not a loose collection of tribes, but a highly centralized, tightly organized state. And then there was the art, the heart of Benin's genius. The Benin Bronzes, perhaps the most famous legacy of the kingdom, were not just art objects. They were historical records. Each plaque and sculpture told a story, of kings, of battles, of rituals, of daily life. They were so finely cast, with such advanced techniques, that when Europeans first encountered them, many refused to believe they had been made in Africa. Some even claimed they must have come from ancient Greece or lost civilizations. That disbelief wasn't rooted in science, it was rooted in racism. Because to accept the truth of the Bronzes was to admit that Africans had created a civilization on par with, if not surpassing, Europe's. But here's the most astonishing part. Benin did not seek greatness through reckless conquest. Its power was not built on constant war, but on stability, trade, and internal organization. Its influence stretched across the region through diplomacy, markets, and cultural prestige. This was a kingdom that built not just with weapons, but with ideas, artistry, and vision. And yet, despite all this, Benin is absent from the great lists of world civilizations. Why? Because the story of Benin threatened the colonial narrative. If Africa could produce a kingdom like this, sophisticated, powerful, and artistically brilliant, then the very foundations of Europe's so-called civilizing mission would crumble. So history was rewritten. The walls of Benin, the palaces, the bronzes, all were dismissed, ignored, or worse, stolen and hidden in European museums. But the silence cannot erase the truth. Benin was not a tribal kingdom. It was one of the greatest civilizations in human history. A lost world, yes, but only because it was buried under lies. And as we unveil this world, as we step into its golden streets, its bustling markets, its grand palace, we see something far more important: proof. Proof that Africa was always part of the global story of human brilliance. Proof that the greatness of civilization belongs not to one race, not to one continent, but to humanity itself. At its height, from the 13th to the 19th centuries, the Kingdom of Benin reached what historians call its golden age, a period of extraordinary stability, wealth, and innovation. To step into Benin City at this time was to step into a masterpiece of urban planning. The streets were wide and straight, carefully laid out in a grid-like pattern. Travelers noted that the city was divided into districts, each governed by chiefs who answered directly to the Oba. This wasn't accidental. It was deliberate, a vision of order imposed on the landscape, proof that Benin understood the art of building not just houses, but a functioning metropolis. At the center stood the royal palace, the beating heart of the empire. Spanning acres, it wasn't a single building, but a sprawling complex of courtyards, halls, and shrines. The palace walls were decorated with carved ivory and adorned with bronze plaques, each telling stories of past kings, important battles, and sacred rituals. To enter the palace was to walk into living history, every corridor echoing with centuries of memory. For the people of Benin, the palace wasn't just where the Oba lived, it was the sacred center of the world. And what a world it was! The kingdom thrived on trade. Benin exported pepper, cloth, ivory, beads, and palm oil, while importing copper, coral, and even firearms through its contact with Europeans. Its trading network stretched across West Africa and beyond, connecting it to global markets centuries before colonization. This trade wasn't chaotic. It was regulated, managed by the state, ensuring that wealth flowed into the capital and strengthened the Oba's rule. But what set Benin apart most vividly was its artistry. Nowhere is this clearer than in the legendary Benin Bronzes. These works, crafted by the Eigen Iranwan, the Royal Guild of Bronze Casters, are still regarded as some of the finest examples of metalwork in human history. Using the lost wax casting technique, artisans created plaques, heads, and statues with astonishing precision. They captured facial expressions, royal regalia, battle scenes, and ceremonial rituals in details so vivid it seemed the metal itself was alive. To this day, metallurgists marvel at their skill. How, without modern tools, did these artisans achieve such perfect casts, such delicate lines, such symmetry? For centuries, the answer has been suppressed by a colonial lie, that Africans lacked civilization. But the bronzes themselves shatter that lie. They stand as undeniable proof of technical mastery, historical consciousness, and cultural brilliance. Art was not decoration in Benin, it was identity. Each piece told a story, preserved a legacy, and reinforced the divine authority of the Oba. Bronze heads were cast to honor deceased kings, linking the living Oba with his ancestors. Plaques decorated the palace walls, reminding all who entered of the dynasty's strength. Even everyday items like bells, staffs, and ceremonial swords were infused with artistry and symbolism. To hold a piece of Benin art was to hold both history and spirituality in your hands. Beyond art, the kingdom excelled in organization and governance. The Oba was supreme, but his power was supported and balanced by councils of chiefs and guilds. These guilds weren't just economic. Each had religious and social duties. The Guild of Brass Workers, for instance, was tied to rituals that honored the ancestors. The Guild of Ivory Carvers played roles in sacred ceremonies. This fusion of art, politics, and religion created a society where every profession was meaningful, every role connected to the larger whole. Even agriculture was advanced. Farmers cultivated yam, cassava, maize, and palm trees with systems designed to sustain a large population. The stability of Benin's food supply allowed the kingdom to support armies, artisans, and traders. A city of hundreds of thousands thrived not by accident, but by careful management of land and resources. What's perhaps most remarkable is the sense of balance in Benin's golden age. Power and spirituality, art and governance, economy and ritual, all were woven together. The Oba ruled not just as a king, but as a sacred figure embodying the health of the kingdom. His well-being was tied to the well-being of the land. His rituals were believed to ensure fertility, rain, and prosperity. In this way, politics and spirituality were inseparable, each reinforcing the other. Benin's golden age wasn't merely about wealth or power, it was about vision. A vision of society where order, art, and sacred authority created harmony. A vision where a kingdom could flourish not in the shadow of Europe, but alongside it on its own terms. And yet, this very brilliance would become its undoing. For as Benin thrived, European empires took notice. Its wealth, its artistry, its political stability, these became targets. The Golden Age was not only a time of glory, but also the beginning of dangerous entanglements with outsiders who came not to marvel but to exploit. The kingdom had built its greatness on balance, but the arrival of foreign powers threatened to tip that balance forever. When history remembers kingdoms, it often remembers only kings and battles. But the true heartbeat of Benin was not only in its palace or its armies, it was in the rhythm of daily life, in the artisans' workshops, in the bustling markets, in the rituals carried out at shrines, and in the roles of men, women, and children who gave the kingdom its soul. Let us walk for a moment through Benin City at its height. The day begins with the sound of drums echoing across the streets, some calling worshippers to the shrines of the gods, others marking the start of trading in the markets. The streets are wide, orderly, swept clean by the people who live along them. Sunlight filters through palm fronds, and the smell of roasting yam and palm oil fills the air. This is not a place of silence and isolation. It is a living, breathing metropolis. The marketplaces. At the center of the city lies the Great Market, a place that foreign visitors often described with astonishment. Hundreds of stalls, lined in neat rows, sell everything from yam, cassava, and maize to beads, cloth, ivory, and iron tools. Women play a central role here, not just as traders but as economic powerhouses. In fact, much of the day-to-day commerce of Benin was managed by women, who controlled the sale of food, cloth, and household goods. Unlike the stereotype of African societies as patriarchal and rigid, Benin had queen mothers, known as Ioba, women of immense power and influence. The most famous, Idia, the mother of Oba Esigi in the 16th century, was not only a political advisor but also a spiritual protector of the kingdom. Her legacy was immortalized in ivory masks, some of the most iconic works of Benin art. The artisans. Beyond the markets, the steady hammering of bronze casters fills the air. In their forges, members of the Eigen Guild are at work, preparing molds for plaques and statues destined for the palace. The lost wax casting technique they use requires extraordinary skill. First sculpting a figure in wax, then encasing it in clay, then melting the wax away and filling the mold with molten metal. One mistake and weeks of work are lost. But in Benin, failure was rare. Generations of knowledge had been passed down, ensuring mastery. In another district, ivory carvers are at work, turning tusks into intricate depictions of battles, gods and royal ceremonies. Their craft is not only artistic but sacred, as ivory itself carried spiritual power. Nearby, woodcarvers and leather workers prepare masks, drums and ritual items for ceremonies. Each artisan is part of a guild, each guild part of the kingdom's great machine of culture and economy. Religion and spiritual life. Religion is everywhere in Benin. Shrines line the streets, each dedicated to different deities, ancestors, or protective spirits. The people of Benin believe the world is interconnected. The living, the dead, the gods, and the natural world are bound together. Daily rituals keep this balance intact. Offerings of kola nuts, palm wine, and animal sacrifice are common, meant to maintain harmony between the human and spiritual realms. The Oba himself is not just a king but the chief priest of the kingdom. His role is sacred. He is responsible for ensuring rain falls, crops grow, and the people prosper. His palace ceremonies are not mere performances. They are acts believed to sustain the very universe. Law and order. Benin's society is also governed by a sophisticated system of laws. Disputes are settled in public hearings, overseen by chiefs who act as judges. Theft, dishonesty in trade, or violations of guild rules are punished, but the focus is often on restoring balance rather than simple punishment. Justice in Benin is not arbitrary. It is codified, rooted in tradition, and meant to ensure social harmony. Everyday people. For the ordinary citizen, life in Benin is both demanding and rewarding. Farmers rise early to tend to yam fields and palm groves, providing the staple crops that feed the city. Hunters bring in game from surrounding forests, while fishermen supply the markets with river fish. Children learn early to assist in their family's work. Girls often helping their mothers in trade, boys learning crafts or farming from their fathers. But even in daily routines there is beauty. Music, dance, and storytelling are constant companions. At night, families gather around fires, listening to elders recount the stories of the gods, the heroes, and the obas of old. These stories aren't just entertainment, they are education, preserving culture and identity. The bigger picture. What emerges from this glimpse into daily life is a picture of a society that is anything but primitive. It is dynamic, layered, and deeply sophisticated. A society where women can wield immense power, where artisans are revered for their skill, where religion and governance are intertwined, and where even ordinary farmers and traders contribute to the grandeur of the empire. To understand Benin is to destroy the false myths of Africa as a dark continent. Here was a world full of light, order, and creativity. A world where life was not just survival but flourishing. And yet, this vibrant society would soon come into dangerous contact with outsiders. Traders first, then missionaries, then soldiers. What began as exchange would eventually lead to tragedy. But before that tragedy unfolded, Benin had already proven itself. A civilization of brilliance, unmatched in art, governance, and spirit. This was not a footnote in history. This was a chapter the world tried to tear out of the book, but one we are now reclaiming. For centuries, the Kingdom of Benin had stood as a beacon of African brilliance. Its artistry unmatched, its governance complex, its spiritual depth profound. But history often teaches us that empires do not exist in isolation. Waves of change, driven by forces far beyond the palace walls, began to lap against the shores of Benin. And with those waves came Europe. At first, the encounter was cautious, even diplomatic. In the late 15th century, Portuguese sailors arrived on the coast of West Africa. They were not conquerors then, but merchants seeking trade. To them, Benin was a wonder, an organized city-state with streets so wide and walls so imposing that many likened it to the capitals of Europe. The Portuguese brought brass and copper, which Benin's master craftsmen reshaped into plaques and statues, immortalizing their kings and ancestors. They took away ivory, pepper, cloth, and in limited cases enslaved captives. For a time, it seemed a mutual exchange, goods for goods, skill for resource, culture meeting culture. But trade is rarely innocent. Over the centuries, new European powers arrived. First the Dutch, then the British. Each came with greater hunger, greater ambition, and a worldview increasingly shaped by empire. What had once been a balanced relationship began to shift. European demands warped the rhythm of African economies, and where diplomacy faltered, pressure followed. By the 19th century, Britain's gaze fixed firmly on Benin. The Industrial Revolution had transformed its needs. No longer was Europe satisfied with ivory and pepper. It now craved palm oil, a resource essential for lubricating machines and producing soap. Palm oil was the gold of the new age, and Britain sought to control its trade at all costs. Yet Benin was not passive. The Obas of Benin, guardians of their people's sovereignty, resisted foreign intrusion. They restricted direct trade, insisting that exchanges occur on their terms, through traditional structures. To Britain this was defiance. To Benin it was survival. Tensions simmered. Throughout the late 1800s, Britain attempted to impose treaties, seeking to erode Benin's independence. The Oba, Oven Ramon Nagbesai, stood firm, wary of foreign manipulation. Then in 1897, everything unraveled. A British trade mission, led by Acting Consul General James Phillips, set out for Benin, despite warnings that their entry would provoke conflict. Phillips carried not just documents but hidden weapons, his true intention being to pressure the Oba into opening Benin fully to British trade. Benin's chiefs, seeing through the ploy, ordered resistance. The mission was ambushed before it reached the city. Many British officers were killed. London seized the moment. What had been an act of defense was reframed as barbarism, a crime demanding punishment. Thus was born the Benin Punitive Expedition of 1897. In February of that year, thousands of British soldiers, armed with Maxim guns and modern artillery, marched on Benin City. What followed was not war in the traditional sense but annihilation. The city was set ablaze, its shrines desecrated, its treasures plundered. The once proud palace, center of centuries of culture, was reduced to ruins. The Oba was captured and later exiled to Calabar, far from the kingdom he once ruled. And perhaps most infamous of all, the Benin Bronzes, masterpieces of brass, ivory, and wood that chronicled the kingdom's history, were stolen. Shipped to Britain and scattered across European museums, these works became trophies of conquest, symbols of cultural theft on a scale the world had rarely seen. The punitive expedition was not just a military assault. It was a cultural wound, a deliberate attempt to erase a civilization's pride and rewrite its story under colonial power. For Africa, Benin's fall was a chilling reminder. No matter how sophisticated, no matter how organized, no matter how spiritually rooted, no kingdom was safe from the machinery of empire. And yet, the story did not end there. The flames of 1897 did not consume memory. The spirit of Benin, its artistry, its rituals, its legacy, endured. The British thought they had ended Benin in 1897. They believed that with the Oba exiled, the palace destroyed, and the treasures shipped overseas, an empire had been erased from history. But they were wrong. Because the Kingdom of Benin was more than walls of clay and bronze. It was spirit. It was memory. It was identity. And those cannot be burned or looted. Despite the devastation, the dynasty of the Obas survived. Though Oba Oven Ramon was forced into exile, his descendants kept the throne alive. Today the royal line remains unbroken. The current Oba of Benin, His Royal Majesty Uwer II, is not a relic of the past, but a living symbol of continuity, a reminder that colonial conquest could not erase a throne that has stood for centuries. The Palace of the Oba, rebuilt and thriving in Benin City, stands as a cultural beacon. Within its courtyards, traditions live on. Royal ceremonies are still performed. The drums still echo. The sacred guilds still work, preserving knowledge passed down for generations. It is not the palace that fell in 1897, it is the palace reborn. Among the Edo people, cultural pride burns bright. Festivals such as the Igu, honoring the Oba and the ancestors, are celebrated with the same grandeur as in the old days. The vibrant colors, the music, the masquerades, all speak to a people who refuse to let history be defined by their colonizers. And then there are the Benin Bronzes. Ironically, what the British sought to humiliate Benin with became the very proof of its greatness. Today, the bronzes are admired worldwide as some of the finest artworks ever produced. Their detail, complexity, and symbolism shattered the racist myth that Africa had no history, no art, no civilization. But for the Edo, these bronzes are not just art, they are fragments of their soul. Each plaque, each sculpture, once held sacred meaning in rituals, recording dynasties, victories, and cosmic order. Torn from their home, they became silent ambassadors, displayed in foreign museums under foreign lights. Yet in their silence, they spoke louder than ever. They testified to the genius of Africa. They exposed the hypocrisy of empire. And they ignited a global movement for repatriation, the call to bring them home. Today, as bronzes begin to return from Berlin, London, and other museums, they are welcomed not only as treasures, but as long-lost children returning to their mother's embrace. Their journey back is not just about objects, it is about dignity, memory, and justice. The legacy of Benin, then, is layered. It is the tragedy of fire and conquest. But it is also the triumph of survival. A kingdom that colonial powers thought they could erase still breathes, still drums, still remembers. The Benin Bronzes have become more than art. They are symbols of stolen heritage, yes, but also of eternal resilience, of cultural genius, and of a people whose history cannot be silenced. The story of Benin does not end in ashes. Though the kingdom was burned, though its treasures were stolen and its Oba dethroned, the spirit of Benin has never been extinguished. In fact, in our own time, we are witnessing something extraordinary, a rebirth, a reclamation of heritage long denied. Across Europe and America, museums that once displayed the Benin Bronzes as trophies of conquest now face pressure to return them. Germany in 2022 began the process of officially sending dozens of looted bronzes back to Nigeria. Other institutions, like the Smithsonian in Washington, the Horniman Museum in London, and universities in the US, have followed suit, transferring ownership or repatriating these works to their rightful home. For the Edo people and for Africans everywhere, these acts are not merely about art, they are about justice, dignity, and historical truth. Each bronze that comes home is a fragment of memory restored, a voice of the ancestors speaking again. But this rebirth is not only about the past. In Benin City today, new initiatives are underway to ensure the kingdom's legacy lives on for future generations. The planned Edo Museum of West African Art, EMOA, is set to be a world-class institution, designed not just to house returned treasures but to tell Africa's story in Africa's own voice. Nigerian artists, historians, and cultural leaders are working to reclaim ownership of the narrative, showing the world that Benin is not frozen in the past. It is alive, evolving, and inspiring. And perhaps most powerful of all is the resilience of tradition itself. The Oba of Benin, once exiled by the British, remains enthroned today. His palace continues to be a spiritual and cultural center, reminding all who visit that kingship, identity, and faith survived colonial violence. Festivals, rituals, and ancestral veneration remain vibrant, binding the people to their heritage in a way no empire could erase. The world now looks to Benin not as a conquered kingdom but as a symbol of survival and resurgence. The kingdom that once dazzled European visitors with its order and artistry is now reclaiming its place as a beacon of African genius. The tragedy of 1897 cannot be undone, but through memory, reclamation, and resilience, the spirit of Benin rises once again.